Welcome to our Streaming Media West discussion on VR 360 video. Flash in the pan or here to stay? Most of the folks that have tried 360-degree streaming agree that it's a fantastic way to virtually experience live music and sporting events, as well as destinations and live news. But is it just a fad, as 3D TVs turned out to be? Or will it use its potential to really connect with viewers when selling complex, futuristic visions of products and enterprises? Today, our panelists are going to share how companies are using VR 360 today, and then you'll get to decide whether it's a flash in the pan or here for the long term. So for our folks in the audience, before we dive in, let's do a quick poll so we have a better sense for which topics might be most interesting to you. So by show of hands, how many of you have tried 360-degree video of any kind? It looks like about 3/4 of the audience. How many of you have experienced 360-degree live streaming? Looks like about half. How many have created a 360-degree experience for others? About a fifth, if I'm being generous. And how many are considering jumping into creating 360-degree content, video content? All right, 2 hands. And how many of you understand the difference between virtual reality and 360-degree video? Almost everybody. Awesome. All right, well, we'll touch on that for those of you who don't, but thank you for that. All right, well, let's quickly meet our panelists. I'll start at this end, and we'll work our way down. I'll start with myself. My name is Chris Knowlton. I work at Microsoft on a product called Microsoft Stream, which delivers video to enterprises. Let's go down the panel and have you each speak briefly about what it is you do and who you work for.
I'm Scott Squires, co-founder and creative director at Pixvana. We're a company that built a cloud-based system to make 360 videos easier for the creators and better quality. So we're stitching display on the full range of headsets. We also have a production arm, so we do a lot of productions for different companies as well.
I'm David Gull. I'm the CEO of OuterRealm, and we're focused on sharing real estate properties with potential prospective buyers and lessors. And we have both what we're calling true virtual reality experiences, but then also web distribution via 360.
Raj Moorjani. I'm at Disney ABC. I work on emerging platforms and technology, so my main area of focus has been on the news side for virtual reality, 360, and augmented reality productions, as well as data-driven visuals, like working with 538, Nate Silver's company.
I'm Casey Charvet. I'm the founder and CEO of Gigcasters, and we are a services firm specializing in engineering, development, and integration for live streaming for professional content creators and rights holders.
Great, thank you very much. All right, panel, let's start off with a basic question that came up just a minute ago for those folks in the audience who may still be struggling with the difference between virtual reality and 360-degree video. Since a lot of the folks understood that difference, we won't spend a lot of time on it, but if I could get just a couple of you maybe to touch briefly on how you describe the difference.
Well, for me, the way I look at VR and 360 is just the freedom of movement. So look at, virtual reality offers 6 degrees of freedom where you feel like you can walk around a space, lean in, grab things, and 360 is sort of 3 degrees of freedom where you can look side to side, up and down, and that's about it. And sort of and the immersion could be significantly less than the virtual reality experience. So that's how I sort of tend to define that.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that nails it, but I'll just add that the same is true on the creation side as well, right? So creating 360 is relatively easy where you're capturing something from a fixed point in space. Creating virtual reality typically requires something much more complex, either photogrammetry if it's an existing space, or complete virtual computer-generated stuff if it's not existing.
Great.
I'll add on that and say that I think that 360 video can be either a standalone experience or it can be a component that's wrapped up into VR optionally.
Okay, thank you. Audience, one of the things I'd like to point out is that we'd like to make this an interactive session. So while we can reserve some time at the end for questions, what we'd rather do is have you asking your questions as we're going so that we can engage with you in the moment as you think of those thoughts, and we can respond in real time. So if you have questions, please raise your hand right away. We'd love to hear from you. If we can't hear it, I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it and folks watching the broadcast can hear it. So again, if anytime you have a question, just shout out or raise your hand and we'll get that question asked. Okay. Well, how about if, so for our audience to understand better sort of where each of you are coming from, can you take a few minutes to sort of walk through what your primary scenarios that you're focusing on for your customer base and how that fits in with VR 360? Scott, let's start with you.
Okay, so what we do as a production company is we'll be contacted by different companies, and I guess we'll get into specifics later, where they have a need, and we're focused primarily on enterprise customers. And so we work with them on what they want to, the story they want to tell, or the training and so forth that they want to put together. We storyboard that, work with them, and then we go and photograph that, edit it, and put it together. And as a cloud company, we have access or provide access to filmmakers to go ahead and upload your footage and to get it distributed in an easy way. One of those is VR casting, which allows people to go ahead and just send it. You can just give somebody a code just like you do a URL, and they can put on any headset and view that without having to download it and move it over and do a side loading process. So that's primarily our focus.
Okay, thanks. David?
Yeah, and for us, we're trying to reach that real estate market, and so our current philosophy is really meeting our customer or prospective buyer where they are, and so we've just started with creating the highest quality virtual replica of a property, and then delivering that to the customers in different formats, again, depending on what they have available. So if they have an Oculus or a Vive, you get the full immersive virtual reality experience. If you're at home and you have a headset, you get a web VR 360 experience. If you're at home and you don't have a headset, you get a desktop or mobile 360 experience. And then if you really want the quick consumption, we do distill it down to images. So just making sure that we're meeting folks where they are with their current hardware, since we know that this is still a highly undeveloped VR market.
And is that all dynamic? Is it just auto-sensing based on the device they're coming in with?
It's not between the Oculus and the Vive, but it is in terms of the web delivery.
Okay, yeah. Great, thanks. Raj, what do you do with ABC and your
Yeah,
customers?
so I've had the pleasure to work on the journalism side for the emerging technologies for VR and AR. And so specifically for VR and 360, we launched ABC News VR about a little over 3 years ago. Since then, we've launched over 100 pieces, roughly totaling over 130 million views. And so we look at 3 specific types of categories of news. There's breaking news, there's live and special events, and there are features or documentary magazine style pieces. So for the latter, we did pieces where we took you to Syria and we chronicled like these young archaeologists protecting Syrian antiquities from ISIS, or took you to North Korea and during like their workers' celebration parade. To breaking news type stuff where we covered the storm, the big snowstorm that happened in New York a couple of years ago, and we had a correspondent with just a simple 360 camera, sits in the middle of Times Square, record the snowfall and the mountains of snow in the middle of Times Square, and that got over like 18 million views there. That was just like 2.5 minutes of raw video. And then the live and special events, we've covered New Year's Eve live 360 to Good Morning America does these concerts in the parks, and so we've done like live 360 stuff there. And so those are 3 specific categories that we'd like to focus on.
Okay. Casey?
Right. So we do a lot of work with agencies and such as like creative agencies and in the form of branded content creation in the entertainment space. And so, and a lot of this is in the live sphere. So most of the time our workflow sort of begins with an examination of what the digital vision is, what sort of messages are trying to be conveyed regarding the content sponsor or the content creator. And then we kind of dive into the technical requirements, which for live VR can be kind of steep. And I know we'll get to this down the road, but this is sort of where a lot of the VR projects that I've bid out have died, is sort of when we get to the technical requirements stage and sponsors start to get cold feet and they begin to look at other alternatives. So, but I think that we're in, as you mentioned, a very undeveloped field, and so we're constantly trying to find new solutions on how to do things like content transport and work around the technical limitations that we see.
Got it. All right. So with all of that in mind, then I guess given that sometimes there's some challenges in getting started, and maybe the trajectory is a little bit slower than you might have expected, where would you see the strongest growth right now? Where would you say that the market really is resonating, even as it's starting to pick up from its undeveloped stage to getting a little bit more fluid?
So I think the content space, the concert space, sorry, is one of the strongest opportunities that we see. One of the major problems with this, though, is that a lot of concerts are set up in sort of a 2D experience, right? The stage has traditionally been a very sort of stages in front, audiences over here, and your eyes are forward. And so what do we do with the rest of that experience in the immersion, and how do we actually make it immersive to where we're not just plopping down a 360 camera where we would normally use a traditional camera? And so I think from my perspective, one of the most interesting aspects is what we can do to enhance that immersive experience. And this is where I think, as I mentioned earlier, the VR and the 360 video are complementary technologies. It's sort of not one or the other, but they can overlap. You can have a 360 video, and then to sort of actually take advantage of the fact that you have 360 video, you begin to incorporate these virtual elements to enhance the immersion of the experience. And audio is a big part of that, but I think there's also visual components as well. Or since we're in entertainment, that's sort of what we focus on primarily, but I can see how in the journalism aspect, things like metadata would also be very important there.
Scott.
So early on, we saw a lot of branding opportunities. Volvo, Sparkling Ice, a lot of commercial companies were interested in trying to get their brand out in this whole new 360 video experience.
And can I ask, were they creating their own experiences, or were they trying to integrate the branding into somebody else's experience?
Well, in a lot of cases, what they would be doing is doing a typical commercial, and they go, okay, while we're doing this and we have the whole crew here, can we go ahead and shoot a 360 experience and go ahead and capture all of that and reduce the cost of doing a whole nother production. So typically, we did an auxiliary project for them, and that typically got better reviews and better viewing sites than the original commercial that they had us do. Oh, cool. So that worked out well. But what we're seeing more these days is a lot more enterprise types of things, like training. As it was announced like a month ago, Walmart has bought 17,000 Oculus Go's specifically for training, and we're seeing that affect quite a bit now. We're doing a number of HR types of training and so forth. Educational things. We've got a project where we're training waiters for a cruise ship because they have to learn all the 100 tables and the different numbers and where they're located. And with this technology, you can put them on the ship. They can learn all of that even before they get on the ship. We're also the research has shown that the retention rate is much greater and the learning process is much greater in both training and education. 15% to 25% more than traditional video.
Oh, very cool. All right. David?
Yes, very similar. Just the uptick for us has been on the enterprise side, where there's a little more control over the end user having the hardware, right? So the challenge on consumer VR has really been that there just aren't enough headsets out there typically to warrant the kind of expense and budgets that go into the creation costs. So enterprise for us, and we put real estate into the enterprise bucket, but that's been the biggest uptick for us as well.
Can you explain how that would work? I mean, for a customer that is using your services, is that how, I mean, do they already have goggles, headsets that they can use for this when they're like purchasing real estate, or how does that work?
Right, yeah, so again, that's meeting our customers where we are. Technically, our customers are the real estate agents, brokers, and developers. But when I say customer, in that case, I mean the end buyer or prospect. And they're either using an agent's headset or their own headset in their home if they own one, or the Web 360 if they don't own one.
Okay. And so the real estate agents and brokers now are having this hardware available in their offices for their customers to come in and sort of experience an internal tour of a property, that kind of thing?
Yeah, correct. And we're calling that the kind of showroom or sales center model.
Okay.
And that's the equivalent to enterprise where, a Fortune 500 company can afford to and is willing to invest in having the hardware, in their boardrooms or in their training centers.
Okay.
It's sort of the equivalent of that.
Got it. Okay. Thanks. Raj, where are you seeing success?
Yeah, and for us at ABC News, the sort of like the raw capture of scenes and places have been actually, that's where we're seeing a lot of growth there, where we were covering a story nearby and we just plop a 360 camera just to kind of get the sort of like what's happening around like the raw footage there. And because we can then easily post that to Facebook or YouTube, that tends to get a lot of engagement there. And so, and it's a quicker turnaround time too. If you use like a handheld 360 camera, you could shoot and edit something within like the hour and have it up on Facebook pretty quickly. And so that's where it's from a content creation standpoint, has the easiest sort of like workflow, but also it tends to get a lot of eyeballs on it because it's easy to distribute.
Yeah. Is that, so are you doing any post-production on it, or is it just really just
Sometimes, yeah. So it depends. And so, like the Times Square snowstorm, the raw footage of that was like the most appealing. A production, more of a produced 360 piece was something we did actually just recently for the election coverage. We create this whole new set for our election headquarters, and we had the set designer do a 360 tour of the set, and so it was his just a VO of him describing the set, and we just took you to the different parts of the set, and so that also did fairly well for us too. So, but it kind of depends. We've had a little bit more success with the raw footage stuff, but produced pieces also do tend to do very well for us. So it just depends on the story.
And with the raw footage, then the raw video that you're using, is there any audio with that? Are you, like, if somebody happens to be doing, you said sometimes you put it down as sort of a supplemental, it sounded like if you have an interview or something going on over here, a reporter reporting, are you actually putting that audio also with the
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes we'll add the audio portion of the interview to it. We'll cut that down to certain highlights, or we'll have some sort of background music to some of the raw footage if like the audio itself that was captured is not too clear.
Okay, great. Question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. So outside of what Scott and David were talking about on the enterprise side, what tells us that the consumer really wants 360-degree video? I mean, what stats or what metrics can we look at that tells us that beyond novelty, this is something they want to engage with?
Okay, and I'll repeat the question. Outside of the enterprise space, what tells us that consumers actually want to consume 360-degree video other than just sort of the novelty of it?
Well,
Did I capture that correctly? Okay.
the numbers from Oculus are the majority of the people who had the headsets, like the Gear VR, were actually watching video. Because it has a wide variety of things. One of the problems that we face from a consumer standpoint is until the Oculus Go came out at $200, you either had the cardboard experience, which was not very good, or you had to spend $1,000 between the phone and headset or a PC and so forth. And unfortunately, Oculus really hasn't pushed that or done much in the way of marketing because the vast majority of people have never actually even tried VR. So that's step one, is getting people to try VR. And then the other problem is, of course, the content and the price point.
So if I could ask you a follow-up?
Sure.
What do you think is going to drive people to want to try 360-degree video?
So the follow-up is, what do you think is going to drive people to want 360
Well,
degree video?
Okay, so the main thing is, if, and our platform we've got, as has been talked about, you can do it to YouTube and Facebook and the rest of it, and you can see it, and you design it as well for the web. But the whole thing is, first get people acquainted with the headset and see what's possible, both 360 video and VR, both 3 DOF and 6 DOF, so that they can see what the potential is. Because that's, from a consumer standpoint, when you buy something, you want to say, what can I do with this? And part of the problem is, if you're not exposed to it, it's kind of hard to explain VR itself until you've actually experienced it.
And you said 3 DOF and 6 DOF, and you meant 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is like smartphones, it felt like that was kind of a very quick adoption curve, but it actually wasn't, right? It was kind of a 10-year period until the iPhone really made it ubiquitous. So I think we're still in the first 2 to 3 years of that potentially 10-year long adoption curve.
Yeah, and I would just add, for us, it's, it's all based on the story. Okay, so not everything that we do is fit for 360 capture. It doesn't make sense. So we have to look at, is the story that we're covering make sense? Is this a good tool to help enhance that story? We talk a lot about in the news space is how do we take our audience into the story? And 360 and VR capture has been by far like the answer to that, how we bring people into the story. The North Korea piece that we did, it was part of a story that we were recovering for World News, and we tacked on this sort of virtual tour of the place. So we had our broadcast component, our digital component, and our VR component all sort of like working together to enhance that story.
So I try not to get too involved in the creative process of my clients unless they ask, but I think that sort of redefining storytelling is an important aspect to kind of copy onto what you said. It has to be a compelling narrative. Like you have to give people a good reason to put the headset on, and compelling narrative is one of those. Or if you're trying to convey information, and this just kind of ends up going right back to enterprise and training, that you can somehow convince people that they're going to get the information conveyed in a better way through it. But from our perspective, it's more on the narrative side. And yeah, the thing is that streaming has done so well because it basically piggybacked on to monitors, which are attached to everybody's computer already, and headsets are sort of a separate component. And I think that's sort of the big difference there.
Okay, so people are adopted streaming much more rapidly because they already had the monitor in front of them or the screen in front of them, as opposed to having to go out and buy specialty hardware.
Yeah, it was already there. All the necessary pieces were pretty much in place, and the infrastructure was laid, especially with the deployment of broadband to the home in the late 90s, starting in the late 90s. So that really laid all the groundwork. But with VR, we're kind of talking about a completely different experience. And even with the cell phones, I mean, I can't tell you how many times, and I'll sort of use family members of mine as like the test bed for experiences, right? And so I bought the Samsung thing, because I have Samsung phones, and I pop my phone in, and it does pretty good, right? And then I hand it to my wife, and I'm like, check this out. And the phone locks, and she can't unlock my phone, and it sort of just kills the whole experience when it takes all of these extra steps. And so yeah, I think while the phone thing seemed like a great way to go, it's still not really the best experience. And yes, we're still really waiting on that one display device component.
Mm-hmm. Scott, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You started touching on headsets and the number of headsets in the market, and this was in the context of measuring whether or not consumers are interested. Do we have a sense for how many headsets have been sold and how many into enterprise versus consumer scenarios?
I don't have exact numbers because most of the headset people have not released them. I believe as of a year ago, there were something like 5 million Gear VR sold, and there were something like 10 million Google Cardboards that were distributed. Now, part of the problem that you run into is the stickiness side because of the problem, the friction of trying to get the phone and do the rest of it. And because initially, you know, and even now, trying to get good content is somewhat difficult, a lot of people set them aside. So this year, I think the Oculus Go has sold like 500,000 at this point, and then similar numbers, I think, for the Rift and Vive, you know, maybe 1 million. I think the Sony PlayStation supposedly is 2 million. As I understood it. And once again, these are just, you know, not fully released numbers, so they're somewhat of a guesstimate. Just so, of course, in terms of trying to target the consumer market, you have to have, you know, ideally millions and millions of these things so that you can target the audience. And until that is the case, it's going to be difficult, you know, unless you're a niche into a specific target. But the other thing, and we'll probably touch on this later, with the home cameras and things, it's pretty compelling if you record your own home videos with this. I mean, that's been my experience. I've got a couple of small granddaughters because you capture that and it becomes a time capsule. So a year later, you put that on and you're back in that same spot, seeing those same people and seeing everything around you as if you were there. It's very dramatic, and I think a lot of people miss some of those opportunities with the 360 video these days.
Got it. Okay.
That's one of the coolest points I've ever heard raised, is home videos, actually. That makes me kind of think about how things like the home movie camera and VCR drove adoption of all sorts of concepts. I mean, basically the home video creation. That's a pretty interesting point.
Question.
You guys have outlined some use cases, very interesting ones, and also some of them being live. My question is, do you have any use cases coming in or things that you're working on that have more towards ultra low latency or lower latency requirements? Obviously, a concert or real estate or education wouldn't really need to be low latency, but do you have any lower latency use cases that you're looking at?
So to summarize the question, are you looking at any lower latency use cases where having that, you know, less than 1 second or 2 seconds latency would be really key?
Well, we don't focus on live streaming ourselves, but there are certainly companies focused on streaming esports as well as real sports and live action sports where they have to have a very short latency. We also ourselves have technology to do foveated rendering so that as you turn your head, get the best possible quality. For that, we pre-made the videos so that we can go ahead and do very fast switching on the headsets.
So foveated, just if I understand correctly, is where you're looking is where you get in your field of view. That's
Right.
the fove, the foveated. That's going to be the high definition, and you're going to have lower definition around the side, so you don't have to stream as many bits until you turn your head.
Right.
That kind of thing?
The basic concept is we're trapped in a 4K video space typically for the mobile and most of the different devices. But the problem is your headset can actually resolve 5K or even better. You know, if you look at still images, they look very sharp, but if you look at the video, it looks terrible. So that's one of the things that we've done. Now, Oculus Go, they've released something so they can display 5K video and better, you know, just to try to get that last bit out. But that's part of the problem with streaming VR videos. You've got a lot of data, and that 4K sounds great, but you're only seeing 90 degrees, so it comes down to like 900 pixels, and it's got to go through a few other steps, so the quality gets low, and then if you have bandwidth dropouts, then it gets even lower. So that's the whole point for us is, okay, well, if you've spent production money doing a great spot or whatever it might be, but the quality is very low in the headset, there's no point.
Yeah, so we did a project with Nokia. This is actually how I kind of got into the VR space with their viewport adaptive streaming, which is the same principle there, where it's sort of you're taking the underlying principles of adaptive streaming that we all experience with like HLS and Dash formats, and then applying it into a windowed format, a tile-based format. And we actually, because it leveraged HLS and Dash type, we used Dash for that. And because it leveraged that, we could get latency pretty low, not sort of sub-second low, but within the confines of Dash formats at the time.
Which was what, a few seconds?
A few seconds, yeah. We had it stretched out a little bit longer just for user experience, but by making those segment sizes smaller, we could get it tuned to about 2 seconds. I'm not sure why we would really want to do that, except for, I mean, I'm sure there's applications, we just didn't have any. I will say, though, that when we were watching, sort of doing testing and stuff for it, and we had the headsets on, and we were watching ourselves over the shoulder, it's really disorienting, to see yourself to begin with, sort of over the shoulder. But then when it's got this sort of several second delay, that can be pretty disorienting. So maybe for some sort of like over the shoulder VR experience where you're kind of watching yourself, the low latency could be pretty important just to kind of keep that psychological connection to the content.
Another question in the audience. So for the foveated viewing, where you are turning your head in real time, the resolution is improving as you turn your head. How low do we have to get the latency in order for that to be a good experience as you're turning your head?
There's several different formats and different methodologies of doing it. Some are tiled, some are. So part of it depends on how wide a field you're covering, both the headset and the good part that you're showing. And then, what the latency is. So there's trade-offs with all of those, is how much data versus, so if the audience sees a big change from one place to another, then that's a bad experience. So ideally it's fast enough and you adjust the format so that you get the most out of it so that they don't notice it. Doesn't draw major attention to itself.
If you had to sort of make an estimate of it, what are we talking, tens of milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds? What would that be?
No, well, in our case, we've got different formats so that I can turn my head and I can start switching even before you get to that point and you start seeing it. So, and that's variable in our case. We can do some things with that. So we could switch over in the second or two and you won't know it because you're still getting part of the other stuff on top of it. So.
And even as you're looking out straight, you get the full resolution version here, but just like with adaptive bitrate streaming, you get a slightly lower resolution rendition off to the side. So as you turn your head, it's not like going from super high resolution to super low. It's a graduated experience. Is that accurate?
That's
in general?
Yeah, one of our formats does that. It varies as opposed to doing a drop off and saying this is. Some of them do a very low res and then a super high res, and then when you switch, you see that difference.
Yeah, quite a disconnect. Okay. Any other questions on that? Yes, sir.
Is there a predictive component that is incorporated in your work to determine and plan for field of view, either based on the content itself or the user viewing the content?
Is there a predictive component when you're doing field of view streaming like that, so that let me see if I can get this right. Is there a predictive point of view or predictive component so that you can anticipate either based on the content or the viewer's actions which way they're likely to look and build that into, go ahead.
That's right, and just to follow up, the related part of that question is in order to address latency where you're only bringing high resolution to where you anticipate the viewer to be looking based on that content and safety.
Right. So for foveated, there can be certain predictive. That's always been planned. It's been kind of lower on our list priority-wise, but the whole point was to get back the information of where viewers are looking, and if 99 people are always looking that way at this point in the video, we can go ahead and just pre-select that ahead of time, and also we can have it, because it's on the cloud, we can pre-process that video to make it even more so for those particular cases. Currently, we don't do all of that. Just we've got too many other irons in the fire right now. But yes, those are some of the different ideas that people use. And
Okay, thank you. We talked about some of the growth and where you were seeing success. Can you, and I think each of you have touched on this a little bit, but what do you see driving the growth? What is the big thing that's really, is it access to different content, or is it engaging in a different way? What do you see actually for each of you where you said this is where we're seeing success? What do you think is driving that?
I think for us, there's content definitely, but then the distribution points for this content. So, I mean, a couple of years ago, or even like 3 years ago, when we first launched ABC News VR, Facebook 360 wasn't around. Okay, and then that came aboard. The cameras that we had to use were these, giant rigs of like 16, 20, 24 lens cameras, and then Samsung Gear comes out with their handheld stuff, So the camera technology has gotten better. That makes it, that speeds up the workflow, the production, and the post-production of these pieces, but also distribution points like Facebook, YouTube 360, more headsets coming out, like Oculus Go was mentioned, but also Oculus Quest that's going to come out as well. And so as headsets get cheaper, there are more of them available, different ways to consume that content. I mean, that's where I see sort of the more ways people have an opportunity to get exposed to this type of content, this new type of medium, it's just better for all of us. And so I think that's just something that's just going to take time, but that's where you see the growth. It's content creation and the distribution points.
I think for some of the agencies that we work with, saturation of content in the streaming space and branded content in the streaming space is driving people to look for ways to stand out. And I think that this offers a very good way to stand out and allow people to sort of flex some creative muscle. And agencies are always trying to sort of one-up one another anyway, and this is, I think, a good path for them. And I'd like to see them kind of, and I'd encourage them to try to use this more as, it's, there's been low-hanging fruit in the thought of like, oh, we're just going to do, this branded event, and we're going to slap our client's brand logo in connection with it, and we're going to stream it to Facebook and YouTube, and it's going to get 100 million views, and that's going to be great for our client. And I think as sort of people have kind of woken up to the reality of some of those streaming numbers and how low the engagement per view can be, I'm not going to be too specific here, that they're starting to look, they're kind of paying attention again to numbers or to meaningful engagement. And I think that VR and 360 experiences can be part of that strategy.
well, some of the projects that we've done in terms of the training is they want to know how much improved is this worth doing compared to traditional video. So that's part of what the different companies that have hired us are doing, is just measuring the retention rate, the return on investment, all of those types of things. So as long as they see a worthwhile benefit to that it can be more effective or more cost effective. We also do like campus tours for businesses, and I know a lot of universities are doing that, because once again, you can have somebody somewhere on the other side of the planet viewing this in a headset and feel like they're actually at that business campus or experiencing that particular thing. One of the other things that we've been doing is a lot of Comic Cons for Sci-Fi Wire, because once again, it's a great branding experience for them, and people viewing it, whether they're on the headset or web, can look around and see all over and see everybody in their cosplay costumes.
Okay, I think I've heard a couple of times you've each mentioned, I think almost every one of you has mentioned the idea that you are often creating 2D content and 3D content side by side. And I'm wondering, is that sort of typical? Like Casey, you said they want to use 360 video as a differentiator. At the same time, are they still, while they have the production crew there, are they still creating sort of traditional content to reach, say, 10 or 100 times many people who have just that monitor in front of them, to your point earlier, versus, you know, the million that might have the headsets?
Right. So we kind of have to plan the productions differently, especially for live. And that
2D versus 3D, you mean?
yeah, and that involves a lot of different factors in terms of, I mean, granted, it's easy enough to place one 3D camera somewhere in the middle of a 2D production, and that's fine. If you're going to do a from the ground up 3D production with the sort of 3D story narrative component to it, I think it's tough to sandwich that sort of within a 2D production, just because you've got stuff going on in a 2D, like, you know, when you look at a 2D production, you don't really worry about what's behind the cameras.
Right.
Right. So I would say that's a big differentiator there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly our experience. Like, so a couple years ago, we were shooting the Disneyland 60th anniversary special, and so we sort of put into the sort of like the 360 component too. But yeah, you know, it was really like what it looked like was more of like a backstage type experience. So on the production, you know, you have like the jib, you have like, you know, the camera operators and stuff. And you have to strategically place the multiple 360 cameras around the production in order to sort of minimize that the user feels that they're in sort of like a stage production, right? So we had to during one of the scenes where we had recreation of like the parade that happens every night at Disneyland, it was with the Dancing with the Stars folks. So we had to position the camera in a way where it's not blocking the cameras that are for the actual special, but sort of like on the sideline. So in sense, if you're watching the 360 version of it, you're a member of the audience and stuff. And so you see the parade in front of you, and then you look to your left, oh, there's the jib, you know. And that was fine, because like, you know, that it added to that sense of like, oh, I was there in the part of the production, you know. And so that type of sort of story worked for that. But, you know, if you're doing something a little bit more where there's a specific sort of a script and certain types of storyboards, you can't, you know, it's a give and take. It's either, it's been more like a backstage, behind the scenes type experience for like when you're adding a 360 component to already a 2D production.
Well, I guess just to add to that in terms of the issue of worrying about behind you and so forth, Google has been pushing heavily on the 180 format because that just shoots the front 180. And so because it's less data being sent, it also tends to be higher quality. And because it's just two fisheye lenses at eye width apart, the quality remains fairly good. And you get stereo with that. So we've done certain projects with that, and it's very compelling if you have one or two people in front, and it really shows off the stereo effect itself. Now, in terms of immersion, as soon as you look your head too far one way or the other, you're into black space or something else that they've put there. But that's an alternative, certainly, that Google and some other companies are doing. So we've done that for Sci-Fi Wire and a couple of other productions where it made sense.
And I think we've seen that for some professional sporting events where you're on the side of the basketball court, for example, and you have that sort of stereo view 180, so you don't have to look back at the fan sitting right behind you, but you get that full front court, you know, like side court experience.
Yes.
Okay.
And we're kind of the opposite with real estate, where it is like a relatively simple environment. There's not a narrative and there aren't cameramen. So for us, in some ways, the biggest mistake would be to just capture a single still frame front facing, because you might as well capture it in 360, and then you can always distill it down into single frames. But you can't obviously do the opposite. You can't turn a single frame into a 360.
Right. And you've both talked about tours and things like with campus tours and building tours. Is that an experience then where a camera is moving through, or there's a camera that just sort of captures in one spot, and then the user has to sort of manually hop to the next spot, to the next room to see the camera? How are the consumers actually experiencing that?
Right, so to avoid the common nausea problem, we're doing fixed points of view.
Okay.
That moving a camera, animating a camera is probably the best way to give someone a bad experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then people just move through the
hotspot
interface to
navigation
hotspot to hotspot. Okay.
through a portal or whatever
Yep.
method you want to use.
Right, we have a whole back end that you put on the headset and you design your own interactive program. So it's basically hyper jumping from
Yep.
one video to another.
Okay.
You can have moving videos, but as talked about, typically we try to avoid that, but we've done long pullbacks and things like that where people don't get sick, that where you tend to get sick, especially is where you do the rocking motion or something else that the user has no control. But interactivity of 360 is now another opportunity that you have with VR headsets that you typically don't with standard video. You've got a full interactive thing. So not only are you immersed in an experience, but you can move, hyper jump between videos as well and see displays and other information pop up. So it's an interactive experience like a full web page.
Okay. Question from the audience.
Are you seeing any trends towards volumetric type of videos, where from the 360 one focal point to the volumetric of integrating different cameras in the same scene in a virtual reality environment?
Well,
Seeing any trends towards volumetric cameras?
yeah, volumetric, there's now a number of different companies. Microsoft, Intel has, set up studios and stages, as well as a half a dozen other companies. And it's getting better, and it's useful for certain types of things. We haven't done much of that ourselves, but we're certainly expecting that to get better here in the future.
Yeah, volumetric from like a journalism, from a news standpoint, it's tough because of the rig for a lot of these volumetric cameras. They're tend to be larger cameras, large a computer attached to it, lots of wires, and so for it's not a run and gun approach where for a journalist can go from one site to another or be in Syria, and it's a tough set of equipment to move around. So volumetric capture from a journalism standpoint will work if it's a fixed set, a fixed position, just one specific type of story that you're covering there, and so that sort of opportunity hasn't come across for us yet. But it is an interesting sort of form of capture that's worth looking into.
Yeah, we saw some depth map stuff on the horizon with the Ozo product before that got discontinued. So that's kind of where that I would like to see a lot more of that come about, though.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that I think you touched on a little, Scott, and I thought of this when you were mentioning how you sort of do a slow pullback and things like that. What are the other things that, as a content creator, you need to be thinking about when you are creating such content?
Well, interactivity was mentioned earlier, and so I think clever use of interactivity can enhance the story. If you give, my opinion, if you give a user too many options, it just, I think, tends to have the opposite effect of experiencing the story, where it's like, okay, I'm not sure what I need to do here, so I'll just sit back and not do anything, So clever points of interactivity within a story could help enhance that, whether it's touching on a hotspot to push the narrative to a different branch, or move forward the narrative can help, or get additional information. So it's as you just heard a story about let's say this water bottle, and so we want to get more information about the water bottle, and there's a hotspot there that you can sort of touch or grab, and that sort of adds some additional information to that. So I think being clever and sort of have a minimalistic approach to the interactive elements within an immersive story is right now, in my opinion, would be the way to go.
Okay. Scott?
So some other suggestions, if you're shooting 360, is place the camera where you want the viewer to be, and put your head there and look around and say, is this a good spot? One of the other things we try to think about a little bit is the viewer going to be standing for this, or is they sitting, or, because the closer you can recreate what they're experiencing at the time, the better it is for them in order to be there. I guess the other things that we think about, if you're shooting stereo, you want to be very careful about not getting things too close to you, because in the headset, if you get things in stereo too close to you, your eyes cannot resolve that, and it drives you crazy. So sometimes people shoot stereo, but they're just a foot away from this wall or this plant, and that becomes a major distraction as well as a headache-inducing type of thing. So consider those types of things, and what are you trying to tell with this, and try to pick everything's basically a fisheye. So you've got to figure out how close can I be and do I want to be? And actually close VR is the most intimate, but with the stitching, especially if you have multiple cameras, more than just the front and the back, you have more issues with that. So you've got to be aware of what's your closest you can get and still get a good stitch from that.
I'd also add to sort of when creating content, also think about audio. 360 spatial audio, ambisonic audio is a good use of this medium, and so especially if you want to figure out how to best way to guide the viewer to different parts of the scene, use spatial audio to have trigger points where they'll hear something over here and they'll have to turn, So so think about how you can incorporate spatial audio into your production.
Right, and that's a good point. Normally we lav up the actors or other key people in the scene that will be talking, so that when somebody talks over here, you'll hear that over there and turn your head accordingly.
We've been able to do something kind of cool in our experiences, which is let the user choose, and it's either where they have agency over the experience and can essentially free roam and do a self-guided tour, or at the beginning pick a guided tour and just get taken on preset points of interest on a given time duration, and forced to look at certain things. So we've been able to give agency and take agency away.
So in that case, it's just a voiceover?
Yeah, in that case, it's preset. It's basically like watching a video, except you get to move your head,
right,
or one where you're in complete control and timing and location choices are all made by you.
And one I haven't heard come up yet is editing. How do you, once you've captured raw content, and potentially including spatial audio and all, what is the best way to edit that? Are there any things that you have to take into account there?
Yeah, so Adobe Premiere has been sort of like the default tool for us when doing, stereoscopic 4K editing. That's been generally helpful, and Adobe's added a bunch of plugins and tools that help with that. Reaper has been a good tool for helping with sort of spatial audio editing as well, and so those two combined has been helpful for us in our workflow.
I guess the other thing as you're editing, keep in mind that typically the center is where the person's going to be, that's the default start of the video. So think about what they're going to be looking at as you cut from scene to scene. So if you've got somebody walk over here, and that's where they're looking, and then you cut to a scene where the person's now over here, I mean, you basically got this window on of 90 degrees. So if they're not there in this window, then they may take a moment, the viewer may take a moment to find out what happened and who's where at this point.
Right, so having sort of a continuity there as
continuity,
far as where they
exactly,
are in the scene
of that. Now, there are some tools, and some of that we do as well, is where you can say, go ahead, no matter where you're looking, and always place this section as the next interesting thing that they should be looking at, so that that person never misses. The viewer always sees what you intend them to see. So there's different ways of playing some of those types of things as well. I guess the other thing to mention with the audio, one of the downsides is there's no true standard for the ambisonics. There's quite a few different formats, which I was surprised about. many more so than just standard videos. So trying to find out which players support which formats and what you're mixing to is an interesting problem right now.
Okay. Question in the audience.
So besides the business problems and customer, consumers' acceptance of VR, and 360, what are the technological challenges you see in this space? What technical problems would you like to solve?
So besides the consumer acceptance, what are the technology problems that you'd like to solve in this space?
I'd like a really good 360 player that has sort of a good extensible framework for all the other elements we want to bring in.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things I've been surprised about is how quickly the camera manufacturers have ramped up, because just 3 years ago, as was mentioned, we had to kludge in a lot of cameras and go through a very, very painful process because they were just independent cameras, and you had to synchronize and post and do all kinds of other things. So a lot of the technical things have gotten much better in terms of the original production of the things. It's just the whole process still has its pain points through that. And yeah, getting a great end result to the viewers has been one of the issues that we and others have been dealing with.
Yeah, I would say data management for like the post-production process. So if you're talking about whether it's volumetric capture or just true like stereoscopic 3D video where it's a 16 or 24 lens rig, all that data, like 1 minute of footage could be like a gig worth of data. And so how do you manage that, especially when you have to do the stitching process? People looked at clouds, doing stitching in the cloud, but that has to get to the cloud. And so, if you're looking at like, 30 gigs of data for this footage that you've captured, how long would it take to get that uploaded? And some challenges there and how to create some efficiencies around that post-production. I would like to see that.
Another question from the audience.
It's a different question on technology, but at this point, what are you doing for content protection, or is it still too early?
What are you doing for content protection, or is it still too early?
You mean like DRM stuff?
Yeah,
Or?
any ways of protecting the content that's
It's a good question. I mean, for our
Maybe we should start more basically. Are any of you doing any content protection?
for specifically for 360 stuff, there hasn't really been much for our end. I mean, for our regular 2D stuff, yes, there's tons of content protection already there, but hasn't really sort of come up in terms of that. I think from a news standpoint, I think we just want to just get eyeballs on it. So.
Yeah, at this point, we understand that that's something needed, so we have kind of built-in hooks, but at this point, we haven't implemented it, and none of our clients have required that as being part of the process. And in our case, because we can also control which headsets get these, if the client wants, then they can be very pinpoint about who can see their content and who cannot.
I guess the sense that I've gotten, just to sort of comment on this as well from my observations, is that, to your point, Raj, it's really more about getting eyeballs, and you really want as many people to watch it as possible virally, and as many who have headsets or whichever way they can experience it, going to where they are, as you said, David, as opposed to keeping the content away from people. But though I could imagine where for premium content, you go to a concert, front row concert or something, or something like that, you might want to at some point protect it if you get to that point where you have a lot of folks who want that content. Yeah. So I could completely see where that might be an issue. All right, is there one more question from the audience before we wrap up? All right, seeing none, thank you all very much. Thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you for being here.